over the city of Attica was a thick and suffocating heat that smelled of the salt spray, the burning cedar, and the copper tang of the fresh blood. Kratos stood on the high stone ramparts, the atmosphere feeling heavy and pressurized as the Persian army battered the gates with a rhythmic and deafening roar. The sky was a chaotic storm of the orange fire and the gray smoke, where the arrows fell like a sharp and whistling rain against the marble. Kratos felt the vibration of the war in the very stone beneath his boots, a low and steady thud that signaled the beginning of another task for the gods of Olympus. His air was one of a quiet and focused brutality, his breath a shallow rhythm as he looked down at the chaos he had been sent to contain. He moved through the narrow streets of the city, the air whistling as the blades of chaos cut through the ranks of the Persian infantry. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp sound that echoed off the stone walls, filling the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the struggle. He encountered the Persian king, a man whose air was one of a loud and rhythmic arrogance that smelled of the expensive incense and the sweat. The king summoned a massive basilisk, a creature of scale and fire whose air was a suffocating heat that smelled of the sulfur and the old rot. The beast tore through the buildings with a rhythmic and crashing sound, its breath a column of white-hot flame that turned the air into a blinding and pressurized wall. The battle against the basilisk moved from the streets to the high bridges of the city, where the air was a violent gale that smelled of the smoke and the sea. Kratos moved with a brutal and steady speed, the air rushing past him as he avoided the snapping jaws of the beast. He used the environment of the bridge to trap the creature, the air ringing with the sound of the heavy chains grinding against the stone. Every time the basilisk struck, the air was filled with the scent of the scorched marble and the ozone. Kratos delivered a series of final and devastating blows to the head of the monster, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the beast fell from the heights and crashed into the harbor far below. With the beast defeated, Kratos turned his attention back to the Persian king. The air in the palace courtyard was stagnant and smelled of the charred tapestries and the dry dust. The king pleaded for his life, offering gold and power, but his voice was a low and desperate vibration that found no mercy in the heart of the Spartan. Kratos met the gaze of the king, the air between them a physical wall of the cold and steady fire of his duty. He used the king's own treasure chest to silence the man, the air filling with the rhythmic and hollow sound of the gold clinking against the stone. As the king fell, the air of the city seemed to lose its frantic energy, becoming a heavy and expectant stillness that smelled of the cooling ash and the salt. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the air of the world shifted into a sudden and terrifying darkness. It was not the natural coming of the night, but a rhythmic and thick blackness that smelled of the poppies and the cold mist. Kratos looked up and saw the sun chariot of Helios falling from the sky, a streak of gold light that vanished behind the mountains. the air was suddenly split by a low and rhythmic humming sound that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. A massive fog began to roll in from the sea, a suffocating and lightless pressure that carried the scent of the deep earth and the old dreams. The city of Attica was swallowed by the shadows, the air filling with the rhythmic and hollow laughter of something hidden in the dark. Kratos moved through the darkened city, the air around his blades, the only source of light in the thick mist. He encountered the Morpheus beasts, creatures made of the shadow, and the sharp teeth, whose air was one of a cold and hollow hunger. He fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as he cleared the path toward the temple of Helios. He reached the grand entrance where the air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the dried lilies and the ancient incense. Inside the temple, the goddess Athena appeared as a shimmering green mist, her air one of a quiet and sharp urgency. She told him that Helios had been taken, and that the world was falling into an eternal sleep that would never end. The first part of his journey ended as Kratos stood on the threshold of the temple, the air in his lungs a steady and focused rhythm. He saw the black fog of Morpheus spreading across the lands of Greece, the air there turning into a gray and lifeless ash. He knew that the task the gods had given him was no longer just about the war of men, but about the survival of the light itself. He checked the chains on his arms, the metal clicking in the silence of the dark, and prepared to enter the heights of the temple. The world was sleeping, but the ghost of Sparta was a cold and steady flame that would not be extinguished by the dreams. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the mountain pine, and the promise of a struggle that would take him to the edge of the world. The path ahead was hidden by the black mist, but Kratos moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was the master of his own destiny. He entered the halls of the sun, and the air of Attica grew distant as he disappeared into the light. The air inside the temple of Helios was a heavy and gilded stillness that smelled of the old incense, the heated bronze, and the dry dust of the centuries. Kratos moved through the grand hallways where the atmosphere felt thick and pressurized, as if the sun itself had left behind a weight of light that was now cooling into the shadows. The sound of his boots against the marble was a rhythmic and hollow echo that filled the silent chambers. He looked at the massive statues of the sun god, their air one of a quiet and frozen authority that smelled of the high clouds. The black fog of Morpheus was beginning to seep through the cracks in the walls, a cold and rhythmic mist that carried the scent of the poppies and the deep, dreamless sleep. He encountered the mechanical guardians of the temple, bronze warriors that moved with a rhythmic and metallic clatter. Kratos fought with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as the blades of chaos cut through the reinforced armor. He used the sun shields found in the halls to reflect the pale light into the crystal receptors, the air ringing with a high and rhythmic frequency as the ancient stone doors ground open. The atmosphere in the lower vaults was stagnant and smelled of the old oil and the copper tang of the gears. He had to navigate a series of rhythmic and complex puzzles involving the movement of the massive statues to align the beams of the morning light. He felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on the temple, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He reached the central chamber of the sun chariot, where the air was a sudden and intense heat that smelled of the scorched gold and the ozone. The massive horses of Helios, the fire steeds, were trapped in a rhythmic and restless slumber, their breath a pale and shimmering steam in the cold air. Kratos moved toward the steeds, the air around the creatures vibrating with a low and heavy hum that made the very marble of the floor tremble. He needed the power of the sun to break the grip of the black fog, and the air in his lungs was a steady and focused rhythm as he approached the divine animals. He used the primordial fire to wake the steeds. The air suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as the horses flared with a white-hot energy that smelled of the sun and the absolute power. The journey took him through the caves of Olympus, a hidden passage behind the temple where the air was cold and smelled of the mountain water and the ancient stone. He encountered the goddess Eos, the sister of Helios, who appeared as a shimmering pink light in the darkness of the cavern. Her air was one of a quiet and rhythmic sorrow that smelled of the morning dew and the fresh mountain wind. She told him that the Titan Atlas had escaped his bond and had stolen the sun to plunge the world into the chaos. Kratos felt a sense of grim determination. The air in his chest was a cold and steady flame of his own. He moved through the narrow tunnels, the air whistling as he used the new fire magic to light the way through the shadows. He reached the edge of a massive underground chasm where the air was a freezing and violent gale that smelled of the deep earth and the sulfur. To cross the void, he had to summon the fire steeds once more, the air filling with the rhythmic and powerful beating of their flaming hooves. He rode the chariot through the darkness, the air rushing past him in a continuous and rhythmic roar that felt like a mountain of wind. He landed on the far side of the abyss, near the entrance to the pits of Tartarus, where the air was a suffocating pressure that smelled of the rotting meat and the ancient iron. He stood at the gates of the Underworld, the air there a thick gray fog that moved in slow and rhythmic swirls, carrying the hollow moaning of the lost. Inside the dark reaches, he encountered the spirits of the fallen, their air one of a sharp and hollow hunger that smelled of the dry dust and the cold bronze. Kratos fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air ringing with the sound of the metal against the spectral armor. He used the gauntlet of Zeus, a massive weapon of the bronze and the lightning, to smash through the heavy iron doors of the prison. The air around the gauntlet was hot and smelled of the ozone and the scorched stone, its every strike a rhythmic and deafening thud that shook the foundations of the pit. He felt the dark power of the underworld pressing against his mortal skin, but the air in his heart remained a steady pulse of the light he was trying to save. The second part of his journey ended as Kratos reached the banks of the river Lethe, the water of the forgetfulness. The air there was a quiet and ringing silence that smelled of the damp soil and the absolute sleep. He saw the distant and flickering glow of the Elysian fields, the air there a pale and shimmering gold that smelled of the lilies and the fresh mountain pine. He knew that the secret of the sun was hidden in the light, but the air in his lungs was heavy with the scent of the family he had lost. He checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the grave, and prepared to cross the water. The world was still sleeping, and the air of the underworld was waiting for the sound of the first chain being broken. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sulfur and the promise of a truth that would change the world. The path ahead was hidden by the gray mist, but Kratos moved with the steady rhythm of a man who would not be stopped by the dreams or the dead. He entered the river, and the air of the temple grew distant as he disappeared into the dark. The air in the Elysian fields was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the blooming lilies, the fresh mountain pine, and the sweet scent of a spring that never ended. Kratos stepped onto the emerald grass, the atmosphere feeling light and carrying a warmth that was a sharp contrast to the freezing fog of the pits he had just left. The sky here was a pale and shimmering gold, where the clouds moved in a slow and rhythmic drift across a horizon of perfect light. He saw the souls of the blessed wandering through the groves, their air one of a quiet and eternal rest that made the very air in Kratos' chest feel like a heavy weight of lead. In the distance, he saw a small figure running through the trees, and the air suddenly filled with the scent of the home he had burned away. He found his daughter Calliope standing in a meadow where the air was a soft and rhythmic vibration of the songbirds. Her air was one of a pure and steady joy that smelled of the sun-warmed skin and the wild honey. Kratos felt the ice in his heart begin to melt, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and trembling rhythm as he reached out for her. For a moment, the war and the gods were a distant and fading memory, and the air of the world was full of the hope he had thought was lost forever. He held her in his arms, the air around them still, and carrying the scent of the mountain flowers. He was no longer the ghost of Sparta, but a father who had found the one thing that the fires of the past could not destroy. As he sat with his daughter, the air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and cold laughter that echoed through the groves. Persephone, the queen of the underworld, appeared from the shadows of a marble gazebo. Her air, one of a sharp and bitter elegance that smelled of the pomegranate and the old earth. She spoke of her hatred for the gods and her plan to destroy the world by allowing the Titan Atlas to pull the pillar of the world from the sky. The air in the fields turned hot and pressurized as she explained that the light of the sun would be extinguished forever, taking the Elysian fields and his daughter with it. Kratos looked at Calliope and then at the goddess, the air between them a physical wall of a sudden and terrifying choice. Persephone mocked him, telling him that he could stay with his daughter in the fading light or return to his life of the blood and the shadows to save a world that hated him. The air in Kratos' chest turned into a cold and steady flame of a new and final desperation. He knew that if the pillar fell, his daughter would be lost to the void forever. To save her soul, he had to push her away and reclaim the rage he had tried to leave behind. He began to shove the girl from him, the air filling with her rhythmic and heartbroken cries. Every time he pushed her, his skin turned a deeper and more ghostly gray, the air around him smelling of the ash and the metallic tang of the coming war. He reclaimed his blades and the gauntlet of Zeus, the air ringing with the sound of the metal as he turned his back on the only peace he had ever known. He pursued Persephone to the very base of the pillar of the world, a massive stone structure that held the heavens above the earth. The air there was a violent and rhythmic gale that smelled of the ozone and the ancient rock. He found the Titan Atlas, a mountain of stone and flesh that was already tearing at the foundation of the world with a rhythmic and deafening roar. Persephone took to the sky on black wings, her air a chaotic storm of the dark energy that smelled of the sulfur and the funeral pyres. The battle against the goddess was a roar of clashing steel and the rhythmic pulse of the light against the shadows. Kratos used the sun's shield to reflect her dark magic back at her, the air turning hot and smelling of the scorched stone. He moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he used the gauntlet to smash through her divine defenses. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp thud that shook the pillars of the underworld, filling the air with the sparks and the green ichor of the queen. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, a constant and grounding force that made his lungs feel like they were filled with the dry grit of the mountain. The third part of his journey ended as Kratos pinned Persephone against the stone, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. He saw the fire of the sun chariot nearby and knew that the only way to save the world was to use the light to silence the queen. He used the gauntlet of Zeus to deliver a final and devastating strike. The air split by a flash of white-hot energy that smelled of the sun and the absolute power. As Persephone was silenced, the air of the Elysian fields began to tremble with a rhythmic and massive vibration. He had saved the world, but the air in his heart was a cold and lightless void. As he heard the distant and fading voice of his daughter calling his name from across the water, he stood over the fallen goddess, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He had stopped the darkness, but the cost was a weight that even the Ghost of Sparta could not carry easily. He looked up at the pillar of the world, where Atlas was now bound by the heavy chains of the light, the air there a pale and shimmering gold. He was the hero of the gods once more, and the air of the world was waiting for the return of the sun. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the grave, and prepared for the final climb back to the light. The air at the base of the pillar of the world was a violent and pressurized gale that that smelled of the ancient granite, the sharp ozone, and the bitter sulfur of the pits. Kratos stood amidst the wreckage of the divine battle, his body feeling the weight of the mountain and the heavy cost of the choice he had made. The atmosphere was a chaotic swirl of the gray mist and the fading golden light of the sun chariot, which sat nearby like a cooling ember. Above him, the Titan Atlas struggled against the rhythmic and massive vibrations of the earth, his voice a deep and raspy sound that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. The Titan spoke of the gods and their cruelty, his air one of a quiet and heavy burden that smelled of the deep earth and the old stone. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed to complete his task, the air whistling as he used the gauntlet of Zeus to hammer the heavy chains of the light into the foundation of the world. Every strike was a rhythmic and deafening thud that rang through the caverns of the underworld, filling the air with the sparks and the scent of the scorched bronze. He used the power of the sun chariot to bind the Titan to the pillar, the air turning into a blinding white-hot pressure that smelled of the sun and the absolute energy of the heavens. As the locks snapped into place, the air of the world seemed to stabilize, the rhythmic shaking of the earth slowing into a steady and grounding stillness. Atlas looked at the Spartan with eyes that were like cooling embers, his voice a steady vibration in the quiet air. He told Kratos that they would meet again, and that the gods would eventually betray the one who had saved them. Kratos did not answer. The air in his lungs was a shallow and ragged rhythm as he looked back toward the distant light of the Elysian fields. He could no longer hear the voice of his daughter, and the air of the underworld was once again a suffocating mist that smelled of the poppies and the dreamless sleep. He boarded the sun chariot, the air around the fire steeds, a sudden and intense heat that smelled of the ozone and the fresh mountain wind. The journey back to the world of the living was a rhythmic and massive roar of the wind as the chariot climbed through the dark tunnels of the earth. Kratos felt the air change from the stagnant pressure of the pits to the cold and sharp scent of the high clouds. He emerged into the sky over Greece, the air filling with the pale and shimmering gold of the dawn as the sun returned to its rightful place. The black fog of Morpheus began to retreat in a rhythmic and sudden wave of light, the air of the cities turning from the gray ash to the scent of the morning dew and the fresh sea spray. The world was waking up, but the ghost of Sparta felt only a quiet and hollow exhaustion. He reached the high cliffs overlooking the Aegean Sea, the air there a cool and refreshing pressure that smelled of the salt and the mountain pine. Kratos stepped from the chariot, his body feeling the weight of the divine service like a mountain of lead. He lay down on the cold stone, the air in his lungs a steady and heavy rhythm as he looked up at the clear blue of the sky. He had saved the gods and the world, but he was left with nothing but the memory of the touch of his daughter and the scent of the lilies. The atmosphere was a quiet and ringing silence, a moment of a rare and peaceful rest that felt like a dream he could not hold onto. As he lay there, the spirit of Athena and the voice of Helios moved through the air like a shimmering green and gold mist. They spoke of his success and his worthiness to serve the mountain. Their air, one of a quiet and detached approval that smelled of the incense and the ancient bronze. They took the sun chariot and the divine weapons from him, leaving Kratos alone on the cliffside. The air in the square was suddenly stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of his own blood. He was once again just a man. The air around him, a vast and open silence that offered no comfort for the soul he had broken. The final part of his journey ended as Kratos stood at the edge of the precipice, the air whistling a low and steady note in his ears. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun was a bright and rhythmic pulse of energy. The air there, a pale and shimmering gold. He had conquered the dreams and the dead, and the air of Greece was now safe from the eternal night. He felt a sense of a grim and final purpose. The air in his spirit was a cold and steady flame that would carry him toward the next task the gods would demand. He checked the scars on his arms, the skin feeling cool and grounding against the wind, and prepared to walk back into the shadows of his life. The saga of the clouds and the sun was over, and the air of the world was full of the light. Kratos took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sea and the promise of a rest that was still far away. He turned away from the cliff and moved toward the distant smoke of the cities, the air around him still and expectant for what the gods would ask of him next.